My name is Fiona Calloway and I'm 36 years old. 9 minutes after my divorce was finalized, I called my dad and said, "Fire all 27 employees my in-laws planted in your company." I had waited 15 months to say that sentence. I had paid for it too, in ways I'll explain. My dad went quiet on the line. Then he asked me the one question I'd been praying he would finally ask. I thought that phone call would be the hardest part of my day. I was wrong. That same evening, my ex-mother-in-law stood pounding on my apartment door, screaming loud enough for the whole floor to hear. And then, when the screaming didn't work, she lowered her voice and offered me something far more dangerous than her anger. But here's what none of them knew. I had already found the empty shelf. Welcome back to Last Laugh Stories, where family secrets come to light and quiet strength wins the day. We tell stories about people who stopped keeping in the peace and started keeping their dignity. If stories about standing your ground speak to you, drop a comment below and be sure to subscribe, because this one goes places you won't expect. Let me back up because none of this makes sense without my dad. Raymond Calloway started Calloway Mechanical in 1992 with a used welding rig and a truck that needed prayer to start in winter. By the time I was in high school, the company had a real building in Grove City, Ohio, and the whole place smelled like flux and burnt coffee. I grew up doing homework in the break room. I learned to read contracts before I learned to drive, mostly because Dad signed anything a friendly man slid across a table, and somebody in that family had to squint at the fine print. That somebody became my career. I put myself through law school on scholarships and night shifts at a title agency. I never took a dime from the company, which mattered to me more than it probably should have. When I finally came aboard as general counsel and compliance officer, I earned the badge. Same as the welders earned theirs. By 2026, we had 212 employees, 212 families, is how Dad always put it. He knew every name, most of the kids and names, and which crew chief was going through a rough patch. My job was quieter. I managed the contracts, flagged the risks, kept the files in color, coded order by year, and generally functioned as the least fun person in every meeting. Dad used to joke that I read warranty cards for pleasure. He wasn't entirely wrong. Here's the thing about being the careful one, though. Everyone loves you when you catch a problem in a vendor's paperwork. They love you a lot less when the problem you catch is sitting at their dinner table. The first Whitmore hire seemed like a favor. I want you to remember that word. I met Grant Whitmore in 2016 at a hospital charity gala his mother chaired. He was 38 now. He was 28 then. And he was the kind of handsome that apologizes for itself, which is the most effective kind. He remembered my coffee order after one date. He asked questions, and then actually listened to the answers. When he brought me to the Whitmore house that fall, I understood I was being presented the way you'd present a business plan. The house was beautiful from the street. Up close, my occupational habits kicked in, and I noticed the window frames were soft with wrought under fresh white paint. Old money with no money. I didn't have the phrase yet, but I had the feeling. Susan Whitmore met me at the door wearing pearls at 4 in the afternoon. She was charming in a way that felt like being handled, and she knew the first and last names of every powerful person in the county, plus their wives, plus their children's colleges. Over dinner, she asked what I did, and I said I managed contracts and compliance for my father's mechanical contracting firm. Susan set down her fork, smiled at me like I'd passed a test I didn't know I was taking, and said, "Practical. That's exactly what this family needs." Everyone laughed warmly, and I laughed too, because it sounded like a compliment. It took me 9 years to understand it was a job offer. Except I wasn't the one being hired. I was the acquisition. Grant proposed the following spring at a restaurant his mother chose. I said yes with my whole heart, which is the detail I'd change if I could change only one. We married in 2017, 200 guests, most of whom I'd never met. At the reception, Susan stood up with a champagne flue and gave a toast that ended, "Family takes care of family." The room applauded. My dad wiped his eyes. I squeezed Grant's hand and thought I was the luckiest woman in Franklin County. 6 weeks later, Susan called me directly, not Dad me, about Grant's cousin Robbie, who was between opportunities and so good with numbers. Purchasing had an opening. I passed the resume along with a note that said family referral, full disclosure, and I felt virtuous for the disclosure part. Robbie interviewed fine, he got hired. I signed the welcome packet myself because onboarding paperwork ran through compliance, and I remember thinking how nice it was the two families knitting together like that. I still think about that signature, not with guilt exactly with the specific queasiness of a person who watched herself hold the door open and say, "Welcome, so glad you're here." Robbie was polite, showed up on time, and did nothing remarkable in either direction, which I later learned is exactly what the first one is supposed to do. The first one is a test balloon. Nobody sends the real cargo on the test balloon. That Christmas, Susan gave my dad a bottle of scotch older than me and told him Callaway Mechanical was the kind of American story her family was proud to be part of now. Dad glowed. I glowed. The scotch, I would eventually calculate, cost roughly 1/1000th of what that sentence was about to make her. I signed the welcome packet myself. I still think about that. Between 2019 and 2021, Callaway Mechanical grew fast. 3 expansions, 2 new municipal contracts, and a hiring push to match. And somewhere in that growth, a pattern started forming that I noticed the way you notice a faint smell in a house you love. A scheduling clerk who was Susan's goddaughter. An accounts payable associate whose mother played tennis with Susan on Tuesdays. An estimator Grant vouched for from his network, though Grant's network, as far as I could tell, consisted entirely of people his mother had introduced him to. Each resume was thin but legal. Each interview was fine. Each hire went through Marcy Holt, our new HR director, who had come to us, I should mention, on Susan's glowing recommendation, because our old HR manager retired suddenly with a generous package nobody remembered approving. I raised it once in a leadership meeting. I said the referral concentration was getting high, and we might want a conflict of interest policy with more teeth. Marcy laughed kindly. The way you laugh at a child who's worried about the dark. Fiona reads warranty cards for fun, she said, and the room chuckled because that was my brand. And my brand made me easy to dismiss. Dad patted my shoulder on the way out. I want to be clear. I didn't shrug and let it go. I wrote a memo. I updated the KOI disclosure form. I made every new hire sign it. It felt like doing something. And in a sense, it was years later. Those signed forms would matter enormously. But a form is a seat belt. It doesn't stop the other driver from aiming at you. By the summer of 2021, I counted 11 hires with Whitmore fingerprints on them. I was about to learn how they'd get to 27. In September 2021, my dad had a heart attack on the shop floor. He was 60 then, and he went down between 2 rows of pipe talk, and a 23-year-old apprentice did chest compressions until the ambulance came. Triple bypass. He lived. I need you to know right away that he lived, but he was out of the building for 8 months, and the building noticed. I spent that fall driving between the hospital in Columbus and the office in Grove City, and I made a choice I still defend. I chose my father's heartbeat over the org chart. While I was choosing it, Dean Whitmore, Grant's younger brother, 34, a man whose previous job title I never did pin down, volunteered to help out temporarily. Temporary became a desk. The desk became a title, operations director. Grant, who had joined the company 2 years earlier as a client relations VP that Susan had somehow negotiated into existence over a dinner I wasn't at, started introducing Dean to our municipal contacts. And the hiring, which I'd been watching like a hawk, happened while the hawk was in a cardiac ward holding her mother's hand. 16 more people came aboard in those 8 months. Marcy processed everyone. When Dad finally came back, thinner, slower, allergic to conflict in a way the surgery seemed to have installed, he looked at the new org chart and said it was nice to see so much fresh energy. I looked at the same chart and saw a transplant the body hadn't approved. I said so gently in his office with the door shut. He held up a hand, tired. That was the first time I heard the sentence that would run my life for the next 5 years. You don't fire family. My dad said, not angry, certain, the way he was certain about weld temperatures and honest handshakes. I didn't have proof of anything yet, and I want to be honest about that. What I had was a feeling and a diagram. One night in late 2023, I couldn't sleep, so I sat at my kitchen table and drew the company on a legal pad. Every hire since my wedding, every referral line, every reporting relationship. Then I got a red pen and circled everyone connected to the Wetters by blood, by marriage, by tennis. When I finished, I counted the circles twice because I didn't believe the number. 27 people sitting in purchasing, accounts payable, estimating, HR, and operations, which, if you know anything about how money leaves a company, is not a random distribution. It's a supply chain. I brought the legal pad to my dad the next morning. He studied it for a long minute, and I watched something flicker in his face. He's not a stupid man, my dad. He's a loyal one, and those are different weaknesses. Then he slid the pad back across the desk. They are good people. Fee Susan's people are good people. You don't fire family. He meant it as a principle. Susan had spent 6 years making sure it would function as a password. I took my legal pad and went back to my office and did the only things I could do without his signature. I tightened approval thresholds, required dual sign-off on new vendors, and quietly flagged my own access to every purchasing record in the system. It felt like sandbagging before a storm that everyone else insisted was sunshine. 2 months later, I found purchase order 7734, and nothing about my life was quiet again. It was January 2024, and I was doing the least dramatic thing in the world, reconciling quarterly budgets against commodity indexes. Copper had dipped that quarter. Our copper costs had not. I ran the numbers 3 times, then pulled 2 years of invoices from our pipe and fitting supplier, a company called Bright Line Supply LLC. We were paying on average 22% above market. 22% is not a rounding error. 22% on a category that size is a second mortgage every single year. Now, a bad price alone isn't a crime. Sometimes it's a lazy buyer. Sometimes it's an old relationship nobody's rebid. So I did what compliance people do. I looked up the vendor. Bright Line Supply was 5 years old. It had been added to our approved vendor list in 2021 during Dad's 8 months in recovery with a single signature, Dean Whitmore. The company's address was a suite number in a Westerville office park, which for a supposed pipe distributor is a little like a cattle ranch headquartered in a studio apartment. Its listed agent was a name I didn't recognize, Ted Lond, and its website was 3 pages of stock of photos, one of which, I kid you not, showed a warehouse with a forklift company's watermark still faintly visible in the corner. I sat with all of that for a long, careful evening. I didn't call anyone. I didn't march into anyone's office. I'd been the girl who cried pattern before in a leadership meeting, and I'd watched how fast a room full of grown men can turn one woman's diligence into a punchline. This time, I would count every brick before I said the word wall. I started printing invoices, 5 years of them. For 3 weeks, my dining table stopped being a dining table. I laid the invoices out in rows by quarter, taped index cards to the wall, and ate standing at the counter like a raccoon in a nice cardigan. Grant was traveling more that winter. Client relations allegedly, so mostly it was me, a highlighter, and a growing coldness in my stomach. Here's what the paper said. Bright Line's prices crept up in small, polite increments, never enough to trip an audit. Always a hair under the threshold that would have required a second signature. The threshold I myself had set, which meant someone had studied my fences and built their gate exactly 1 in below the top rail. Certain purchase orders repeated, same quantities, same line items, cadenced every few months like a heartbeat, and a handful of POS. The fattest ones were for materials I couldn't match to any job number at all. Copper fittings for projects that didn't exist. I checked the receiving logs against them, and the logs were signed, initialed, complete, and I was beginning to suspect fictional. You know that feeling when a word you've read 100 times suddenly looks misspelled. That was my own company's paperwork. Documents I had trusted for years started looking staged like furniture in a model home. I made myself a rule that January. Verify. Don't assume. For every anomaly. I wrote down the innocent explanation next to the guilty one. And I only kept the ones where innocence required more imagination than guilt. By February, I had a stack of those. The question wasn't whether money was leaking anymore. The question was who was holding the bucket. And I was married into the answer. I asked Grant about Bright Line on a Tuesday night over a dinner I'd cooked, specifically to make the conversation feel unlike an interrogation, which tells you something about the marriage we'd built. I kept it light. Hey, weird one. Do you know anything about Bright Line Supply? Their pricing's off, and I can't find much on the company. Grant's fork paused for half a second. If you've never watched a person you love pause for half a second, I don't recommend it. Then he smiled his gala smile and said, Mom knows the owner. It's fine fee, they're solid people. Mom knows the owner. It's fine, I said. Which owner? Ted Lund. Because the filings are thin, and we're overpaying by 6 figures a year. And Grant put down his fork and looked at me with something I'd never seen on his face before. Not guilt. Worse, patience. The patience of someone who has been waiting for this conversation and rehearsed for it. You do this? He said gently. You take a spreadsheet and you make it a story. Dad's company is fine. Everyone's fine. Can we have one dinner that isn't an audit? We didn't fight. That's the part people never believe. Nobody raised a voice. Nobody left the table. We talked about his sister's kids and a vacation we'd never take. And we loaded the dishwasher side by side like 2 employees of a marriage. But something had ended in that half-second pause. And we both knew it. The way you know a bone is broken before the X-ray. He knew about Bright Line. He'd always known. And when he'd had to choose between telling me the truth and managing me, he'd chosen management, his mother's native language. I went to my dad in March 2024 with a 1-page summary and a price comparison, so simple a 5th grader could follow it. 2 columns. What copper cost the world? What copper cost us? He read it twice. For one glorious minute I watched my actual father surface. The man who once drove a supplier's rep off the lot for padding a fuel surcharge. Then his jaw set and he said he'd look into it quietly. And I made the mistake of believing the sentence meant what the word said. Here's what happened instead, and I can timestamp it because it still amazes me. I left his office at 11:40 in the morning. At 6:15 that same evening, Susan Whitmore arrived at my parents' house with a lasagna, unannounced, for the first time in 4 months. Marcy Hall and my dad's calendar were the only 2 places my meeting existed. You do the math. I did, over dinner. My mother told me this later, apologizing the whole time. Susan dabbed her eyes and talked about how hard I'd been working, how much pressure I put on myself. How Fiona sees ghosts in numbers because she cares so much. She never mentioned Bright Line. She didn't have to. She wasn't rebutting my evidence. She was recategorizing me. From professional to worried daughter, from auditor to stressed wife. It's an elegant move. Honestly. You can't fight it head-on, because objecting to it proves it. By the weekend, Dad was patting my hand and telling me, maybe I should take some time off. The quiet look into it never happened, and that Monday, for the first time in 9 years at my own family's company, I got a meeting invitation from HR with no agenda line. 3 employees had filed complaints about me. The word Marcy used was pattern. She'd learned it from me, I suppose. A pattern of hostile accusatory behavior creating a difficult work environment. All 3 complainants were on my legal pad list of 27. One of them was a man I had spoken to in total twice, once about a parking spot. Marcy slid a memo across the table with the practiced sympathy of a woman putting down a family pet. It was suggested in the passive voice, where all corporate violence lives, that I work remotely for a while for everyone's comfort, while the complaints were reviewed. I want you to sit with the architecture of this. The immune system I had spent years warning about was now diagnosing me as the infection. My badge still worked technically. My name was still on the compliance policies technically, but I was out of the building, and Dean signed for operations and Marcy ran the reviews. And my dad, whose company it was, Told me over the phone, exhausted, that maybe some space was healthy while things calmed down. He wasn't a coward. I need you to understand that he was a 62-year-old man with a rebuilt heart. A company he loved, and two versions of reality being fed to him daily, one of which came with lasagna, and never asked him to fight anybody. Alone in my car in the parking lot, I did allow myself one unprofessional minute. Then I drove to the office supply store and bought 6 plastic file boxes because if they were going to lock me out of the system, I was going to need my own copy everything. It turned out I had a stop to make first, though. Bay 12, purchase order 7734. Through 84,000 of copper fittings, ordered through Brightline received according to assigned initial receiving log into Bay 12 of our warehouse on a Thursday, the previous October before my remote work exile started. I had one afternoon left in the building, and I spent it walking the warehouse floor with a clipboard, looking like a woman doing inventory, feeling like a woman robbing her own bank. Bay 12 is at the back, past the racks of strut and rolls of duct liner, a steel shelving unit tall as a house. According to the paperwork, the 84,000 was sitting on the third shelf. I stood in front of it for a long time. The shelf was empty, not recently empty. Dust lay across it in one smooth, undisturbed gray blanket, the kind that takes seasons to settle. No drag marks, no clean rectangles where pallets had sat. No fork truck scuffs on the concrete below. Whatever that log swore had arrived, unloaded and been shelved right here, had never touched this steel. I took out my phone and photographed it. Wide shot, close-up of the dust. The bay number stenkled on the upright. Timestamps on every frame, one empty shelf, gray and quiet, worth more than my house. It's strange which moments change you, not the spreadsheets. This paper can be argued with. Susan had taught me that in March. But I dare anyone to argue with dust. I stood in the cold aisle light, and I understood fully and finally that I wasn't paranoid. I had never been paranoid, and everything was about to get much worse before it got better. I emailed the photos to my personal account, CC'd my attorney, and walked out past the guard shack, smiling at everyone. Keep that shelf in your mind. We're going to see it again. I gave my husband one last door, and I wanted on the record that I held it open with both the hands. It was a Sunday in early March 2025, almost a year after the lasagna. I put the Bay 12 photos on our kitchen island next to the Brightline summary, and I said, "Stand next to me. We take this to my dad together, you and me. And whatever your family did, you're not part of it as of today." Grant looked at the photos for a long time. And then my husband, the man who remembered my coffee order in 2016, said, "You're asking me to choose against my mother. Family takes care of family fee." There it was. Susan's toast 9 years later, coming out of her son's mouth like a returned product. And I finally heard the sentence for what it had always been. It was never a promise of shelter. It was a claim of ownership, a definition of family with a ledger where the love should be. And I was on the wrong page of it. And so, though he'd never realize it, was Grant. I heard myself answer with a steadiness that surprised us both. "And if you've been with me this far, you know that's not coldness. It's just where I keep my spine." I said, "Okay, just that." I filed for divorce that Thursday, March 13th, 2025, at the Franklin County Courthouse, and the clerk who stamped my petition had kind eyes and a cold and wished me a good weekend. Loss number 1 fully realized the marriage. It had been gone for a year. Now it had a case number. What I did not know standing at that counter was that ending my marriage had just started a chess clock I couldn't see. My divorce attorney's name is Naomi Price. She's 44. She bills like a surgeon and talks like one too. And the first substantive thing she ever did was take away my only weapon. "From this moment until the decree is final," she said, "you touch nothing at that company. No firings, no vendor cancellations, no fraud memos, no dramatic meetings, nothing." I actually laughed. I had a photo of an empty shelf worth $84,000 and a stack of file boxes in my trunk. I was loaded. She didn't laugh back. "Fiona, listen to me like it's a jury instruction. Grant's attorneys are going to argue the increase in that company's value during your marriage is a marital asset. Your name is on its compliance record. The moment you start firing his relatives' youth and canceling vendors, you're not a whistleblower. You're a vindictive wife, sabotaging the asset to shrink his payout. Every true thing you say after that gets read as strategy. They will bury your evidence inside your motive. I sat there hating her. The specific hate you reserve for people who are right. Everything I did would be true, and none of it would be believed. The plan wasn't just protected by my father's loyalty anymore. It was protected by the divorce itself. Wait or lose the company by trying to save it. So, here is the yardstick I offer anyone who has ever been called crazy for waiting. Sometimes the most aggressive move on the board looks exactly like sitting still. So, what am I allowed to do? I asked. Naomi smiled for the first time that day, and I understood why people fear her. Prepare, she said quietly, legally, and completely. And when the clock runs out, be already done. The Whites dragged the divorce out for 15 months. And at first I read it as spite, 2 continuances, a new attorney halfway through, which reset every schedule. Settlement conferences where their side haggled over furniture like we were divorcing over a couch. Fine, I thought. Take your time because I was using mine. I hired a forensic accountant named Priya out of Cincinnati, and paid her $35,000 from my own savings. The down payment fund for a house I no longer needed to buy, which was either poetry or a tax problem, depending on your mood. Nights and weekends. Call Dobbs, my dad's controller for 22 years, the first person inside the walls who believed me, walked me through ledger exports he was fully authorized to share and quietly terrified to be sharing. Anyway, we reconstructed 5 years of bright line, every invoice, every phantom PO, every receiving log signed by the same tight, little initials. Priya's spreadsheet grew a tab, then 9 tabs, then a summary page with a number on it that made even her go quiet on our calls. And buried in my contract files, where it had sat in plain sight the whole time, I reread the Brightline Master Supply agreement and found the clause that reorganized my entire calendar. Automatic renewal, 5-year term, renewing by itself unless in writing at least 30 days before expiration. I checked the expiration date, then checked it again, and then sat very still at my dining table while the index cards on my wall rearranged themselves into a countdown. Cancel by late June 2026, or the company was locked into Brightline until 2031. 5 more years of bleeding wrapped and ribboned in my own department boilerplate. And the divorce, the endless molasses divorce, was scheduled to finalize in mid-June. Once I saw the renewal date, the whole 15 months looked different, like a photograph developing in reverse. I pulled up the procedural history of my own divorce and mapped it against the contract calendar, date by date. The first continuance had been requested the week after Naomi served our initial disclosures, the week their side learned what I knew. The attorney swap, which reset discovery by 90 days, landed us neatly past a window where I might have pushed for an early settlement. Every delay had shuffled the finish line rightward, closer and closer to one particular stretch of late June, until the math was almost elegant. The decree would land roughly 48 hours before the last legal day to cancel Brightline. 48 hours. They hadn't been stalling the divorce out of spite or greed, or even strategy about money. They were running out the clock on a contract. Under the freeze, I couldn't cancel anything while the case was open. And if the case closed 2 days before the deadline, they were betting a newly divorced woman with boxes to unpack and a life to rebuild wouldn't turn around and start a corporate war inside 48 hours. Honestly, reasonable bet. It would work on almost anyone. I called Naomi and told her about the clause, and there was a silence on the line I describe as respectful. Then we don't slip a single day, she said. And Fiona, they'll expect you tired. I looked at my wall of index cards at the shelf photo taped in the middle like a keystone, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 2 years. Not dread. Schedule. They thought they were running out my clock. They had no idea I'd already synchronized my watch to theirs. Priya's final report arrived in April 2026, 81 pages. Spiral-bound because I asked, and it said in accountant language, what I'd been saying in wife language for 2 years. total overcharges and phantom purchases routed through Bright Line Supply LLC across 5 years. 1.9 million, 1.9. I read the number standing up, then sat down and read it again. The report traced the money's little journey. Callaway Mechanical to Bright Line to a management services entity. And the management entity's registered agent was the same name I'd first met on a thin website 2 years earlier. Ted Lundy's corporate records appendix did what I'd never managed from my kitchen. Theodore Lund of Shaker Heights, first cousin to Susan Whitmore, listed in her mother's 1989 obituary as a beloved nephew. The owner mom knew the solid people. I want to describe what I felt, and it wasn't triumph. Have you ever finally found the source of a smell in your house? Actually found it actual thing in an actual wall. You're relieved and you're sick both at once, because now you have to open the wall. My in-laws had built of a straw right through the middle of my father's company and drunk from it for 5 years while sending us Christmas cards, and the receiving logs with the tight little initials, the ones swearing that phantom copper onto empty shelves. Priya matched the initials, Dean Whitmore, Operations Director, the volunteer. I closed the report, squared its edges with the table, the way I do when I need my hands to behave, and wrote one sentence on the cover in pencil. Nobody sees this until the decree. 39 days to go. Let me pause here and ask you something, friend to friend. If you've ever warned your family about someone and watched them believe the charming stranger instead of you, tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want to know exactly what I traded away to get my hands free, stay with me because it's coming. Subscribe so you don't miss how this ends. In May, 5 weeks before trial, Susan made her big move, and I'll admit it was beautifully played. It arrived dressed as peace. Grant's attorney proposed family mediation, not the legal kind, the emotional kind, tea and reconciliation, Susan presiding, and folded gently inside the proposal was the actual offer. The Wetters would withdraw their demand for a revaluation of Callaway Mechanical as a marital asset. The demand that had been hanging over my dad's company like weather, if I would sign a comprehensive confidentiality agreement covering all family and business matters. Read that again. They'd stop pretending they deserved a slice of my father's company in exchange for my silence about why they didn't. Naomi called it what it was. They know what you have. Somewhere in 15 months of discovery, despite our care, a thread had shown. A subpoena that brushed too close to Bright Line. A deposition question. Grant's lawyer objected to a shade too fast. They knew, and instead of panicking, they'd priced it. That's the thing about Susan's world that I'd finally learned to see. Everything is a negotiation, including the truth. Especially the truth. Every scandal has a settlement figure. Every crime is just an invoice nobody's sent yet, and they were so sure I'd take it. Quiet little Fiona, who kept every piece she was ever handed, who signed welcome packets and swallowed toasts. Of course, she'd trade the ugly truth for a clean exit. It's what she'd done her whole life. I told Naomi to decline politely without a counter. Her reply made me laugh out loud in an empty apartment. Declined. They just learned something about you. Expect them to get louder. They got louder. Word reached me through my mother that Susan was telling their circle I'd had some kind of breakdown and was trying to burn down both families on my way out. The county's dinner party circuit ran on her weather system, and the forecast on me was pity with a chance of contempt. That's when I broke my own rule. Half of it. That the freeze bound me at the company. Nothing bound me at my parents' kitchen table. On Memorial Day weekend 2026, while my mom took a casserole to a church thing, I set Priya's report in front of my father, and I didn't say a word while he read. He read for 40 minutes. My dad is not a document man. He moves his lips a little when he reads legal language, a habit I've loved my whole life and would defend with violence. Somewhere around the receiving log appendix, the lip movement stopped. His hands went still on the pages and his shoulders came down, and I watched a man watch 5 years of his handshake get autopsied. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, and what he said broke my heart cleaner than anything Susan ever managed. You don't fire family. But it came out different this time, smaller. It wasn't a law anymore. It was a question. The sound of a man asking whether the sentence he'd built his whole decency on had been picked up and used against him like a crowbar. "No, Dad," I said, and I took his hand across the table. "You don't. But somebody redefined family while we weren't looking, and I'm going to need you to trust me about what happens next." He was quiet a long time then. "What do you need from me?" "Fee." My whole life I'd waited for that question, a phone call. I said, "In 3 weeks when I say now. I want to tell you about the night before the settlement conference because it's the night the real war got decided, and I was the only one in the room. Everything was staged. Priya's reports, backups, the cancellation letter drafted. My dad on standby like the cavalry, and sitting in my apartment with cold tea, I caught myself designing the quiet version. You know the quiet version. Hand the report to Dad. Let him retire 27 people with severance and a handshake. Let Brightline lapse into some negotiated sunset. No press, no police, no scene at any table. The version where Fiona fixes everything, and no one ever has to know Fiona was right. I had been building quiet versions my whole life. Quiet versions are what overresponsible daughters make instead of scenes. We metabolize the family's poison in private and call it strength. We sign the welcome packets. We keep the peace like it's a baby we were handed at birth and told not to drop. And staring at that cold tea, I finally did the arithmetic on it. 15 years of my quiet had bought the Whitmore's time cover, and 1.9 million. My silence had never once protected my family. It had protected the scheme. Those are the words I said out loud, alone at 100 a.m., and saying them felt like putting down something I'd been carrying so long I'd stopped calling it heavy. It had just become my posture. If the truth stayed manageable, it would stay deniable. It had to cost something in daylight, and the person it had to cost was me, my name, my privacy, my precious reputation for being reasonable. I texted Naomi at 1:14 a.m. take the deal to the mat. I'm done being the quiet one. She replied at 6 sharp, about time. Here's what I traded. And I want you to hear the actual numbers, because this is the part where people usually look at me like I've lost my mind. The marital estate centerpiece was our house in Upper Arlington. Sold during the proceedings for $60,000. My share should have been around $320. There were retirement splits, a spousal support ? And Grant's attorneys still making noises about the company's growth during the marriage. At the final settlement conference in early June, Naomi put one package on the table. I would take $40,000 from the house, 40, and waive support, and the retirement split entirely. In exchange, every Whitmore, by name and by entity, permanently released any claim interest or valuation demand against Callaway Mechanical, its ownership, and its assets with a clause Naomi drafted so tight it practically squeaked, covering Grant, Susan, Dean Tedlond, Brightline. And I'm quoting any affiliated person or entity, known or unknown. Their side read it, and you could watch the calculation move through the room like weather. She's paying us to go away. $250,000 of walkway money from the tired, unstable, about to be broke ex-wife. They signed, so fast the notary had to ask them to slow down. Naomi looked at me one last time before I initialed. You're paying them to let go of your father's company. You understand that. Every dollar, I said and signed. And that was the door closing behind me for good. The old life, the house money, the soft landing, the option of ever pretending none of this happened. Gun in blue ink by my own hand. People think the point of no return is something that happens to you. Sometimes you buy it. June 16, 2026. The final hearing took 11 minutes, which is an insulting amount of time to end 9 years, but I've come to appreciate the efficiency. At 9:31 a.m., the judge signed the decree. My marriage was over. The releases were live and the freeze, Naomi's 15-month leash, dissolved like sugar. Grant didn't look at me in the hallway. Susan wasn't there. She considered Curris's vulgar, which, given how much of her life's architecture depended on them, was a luxurious opinion. I walked out onto the courthouse steps into ordinary June sunshine, stood beside a bronze statue of somebody or other, and checked my watch, which I had synchronized. Literally. I'm not being cute. With the deadline calendar taped to my wall, 47 hours and change remained on the bright line cancellation window. They were betting I'd go home and exhale. Instead, at 9:40 a.m., 9 minutes divorced, I called my dad, who had been sitting by his phone since 7 because I'd told him now would come today. Dad, it's done. It's time. Fire all 27. Cal has the files. The labor attorney has the letters. Security's briefed. Marcy goes first before she can touch a single record. There was a pause, and in it, I could hear 34 years of you don't fire family being set down gently like a tool that no longer fit the job. Already got my boots on, my dad said. 64 years old and he sounded 20. I laughed. Standing on the courthouse steps in a gray dress, newly divorced, financially gutted, holding a phone in one hand and 47 hours in the other. You've been waiting to hear how that phone call went. So had I for 15 months. What I hadn't planned for was who'd be standing at my door by dinner time. I wasn't in the building for the firings. Naomi's last piece of advice, and a good one. Let it be the owner's decision executed by counsel. Clean as a health inspection. But Cal called me that night and narrated. And I'm going to give it to you the way he gave it to me, because Cal Dobbs has waited 22 years to be the interesting one at dinner at 11:00 a.m. My dad, the labor attorney, and a note-taker set up in the small conference room, 27 meetings, 10 minutes each. Papers and folders, documented lawful, boring on purpose, no shouting matches, no per walks, undisclosed conflicts of interest, related party transactions violating signed policy. Termination effective today. Here's the severance condition. Here's the door. Marcy Holt went first before her badge could open one more personnel file. And according to Cal, she said almost nothing, which chilled me more than a scene would have. Professionals don't argue. They call someone. Dean Whitmore argued. Dean demanded my father's loyalty, then his gratitude, then, losing altitude, cited his own initials on the receiving logs as proof of his diligence, which the labor attorney wrote down very, very slowly while Dean watched him do it. On his way out, Dean kicked a trash can, and I want you to appreciate that out of everything. The trash can is the part my dad still brings up, delighted like a boy describing a foul ball he caught. By 4:00 p.m. it was done, 27 desks. Security collected badges with the tenderness of a hotel checkout, and Grant never came in at all. At 4:20, my phone lit up with the only message he'd send me that a year. You could have done this quietly. I read it twice, put the phone face down, and said to my empty kitchen, yes, that was the problem. I was still standing there when the knocking started. Hard, flat-handed, urgent, not the police kind, the family kind. Susan Whitmore had never once visited my apartment. She'd have needed to acknowledge it existed first. And acknowledging it meant acknowledging the divorce. The 14 months I'd been gone from the Upper Arlington house, the whole unraveling of her merger. But my address was in the court papers, and there she was through my peephole at 7 p.m., pearls and a wool coat in June, fist against my door. I opened it because you do not get a scene like this twice in your life. 27 people, Fiona. She came in without being asked, and her voice filled the apartment wall to wall. Ungrateful, unstable, vindictive. 27 innocent people, families, mortgages, Christmas. She actually said Christmas in June. And what would people say? And had I thought for 1 second about my father's reputation hauling his own company through the mud like this? I stood by my bookshelf and let it break over me, which was its own strange victory. 2 years earlier, that voice could reorganize my nervous system. And now it was just weather against a window. And then, this is the part I'd have missed at 30. She read the room, recalibrated, and changed instruments. The volume dropped. The chin softened. She sat down on my sofa uninvited, smoothed her coat, and became in one seamless motion warm. Fiona, sweetheart, we're all tired. Let me offer you something reasonable. And here it came, the same deal in its evening gown. Bring back the 15 genuinely innocent ones. Her phrase, and admission tucked inside a kindness. 12 guilty by subtraction. Sign mutual confidentiality. Nothing filed, nothing public. And your father keeps his good name and you keep yours. No one ever needs to know any of it. You're so good at keeping things smooth, dear. It's the best of you. There it was. My whole need appraised and offered back to me as a compliment by the one person who'd always seen exactly what I was made of and exactly how to use it. The smooth exit, the quiet version gift-wrapped. A year ago, it would have worked. I looked at her for a long moment, and then I asked the question I'd been saving since the day I finally understood her. Susan, who signed your welcome packet? She went very still, and for a second, 1 second, the only one I ever saw, Susan Whitmore was not performing. My mother owned a flower shop, she said finally, and her voice had gravel in it I'd never heard. On Lee Road, Lund's Flowers. When I married into the Whites, my father-in-law's debts were. She chose the word like a chess piece, considerable. The shop was collateral nobody asked my mother about. She found out at Thanksgiving. She set the table anyway. Susan smoothed her coat again, and the gravel disappeared back under the pavement. I learned young Fiona, a woman in these families, is either useful or she is furniture. I have spent 40 years being useful. I made sure my sons married useful. That's not cruelty. That's how the world runs. Family takes care of family. And there it was one last time. The toast, the password, the whole cosmology. Love is a supply chain. Marriage is procurement. Her mother's flower shop, billed forward through 4 decades, and cashed out of my father's warehouse. And Susan, both the collector and once long ago the collateral. I felt the near miss of actual pity. I want to be honest about that. It was there and it was real. And if she had stopped talking right then, this might be a different story. She did not stop talking. She stood, gathered her coat, and delivered the exit line she'd surely composed in the car. Sign the agreement, dear, because if this becomes public, the name Calloway will be a punchline at every table from here to Cleveland, and your father's heart, God forbid, with all that stress. Think about what you're choosing. Then she let herself out quietly. A woman confident the math would do her work for her. I stood in my kitchen a long time. Then I took out my phone and confirmed the 8 a.m. meeting for the next morning, the one she didn't know about. 38 hours left on the clock. The conference room on the 2nd floor of Callaway Mechanical holds 12 people and has never once needed to. At 8 a.m. on June 17th, it held 2 representatives from our bonding company, 3 executives from the Harove Group, the healthcare construction client worth 30% of our revenue, my father, Cal, and me. Naomi had walked me through my options last time the night before, and I want you to see the fork in the road exactly as I saw it. Because this meeting was not required. No law compelled it. We could have canceled Brightline with a quiet certified letter, managed the terminations as a private restructuring, and let the whole thing decompose in the dark. Susan's version minus Susan, my version, actually. The version of me who had kept every secret she was ever handed. Instead, I stood up in front of the 2 audiences with the power to hurt us most. The company that bonds the projects and the client that feeds us. And I turned on the projector. First, slide, a photograph of an empty steel shelf, dust like gray felt, bay number stenkled on the upright. This shelf, I said, is where 84,000 of copper was signed for. It was never there. I took this photo more than 2 years ago, and today I can finally tell you why I had to wait. I gave them all of it. Calm as a weather report, Brightline, the 1.9 million, the 27 terminations. The initials on the logs, the referral to a fraud attorney whose engagement letter my dad had signed at 7:15 that morning. Then I picked up the cancellation letter, and with 24 hours left on the auto-renewal clock, I signed it at the head of the table and handed it to Cal for certified mail. Return receipt requested. The Hardrove executives asked hard questions for an hour. The bonding reps asked harder ones. And at the end, exactly as Naomi had predicted, Hargrove's senior VP closed his folder and said the sentence that cost us. We're pausing the Meridian expansion pending our own review. 90 days, $1.4 million in revenue. Breathing on a ventilator because I'd chosen to say fraud out loud in a room instead of whispering severance in a hallway. My dad flinched. I didn't. And it's not because it didn't hurt. It's because I'd already paid this bill once at 100 a.m. with cold tea, and I knew the exchange rate. Word travels in a county like ours, and Susan's forecast came true within the week. The paper ran it as an ugly divorce spilling into a family business. My name right in the lead. Vindictive available between every line. She got that part right. She just priced the wrong thing. "You're right, Susan," I said to nobody, folding the newspaper. "Family takes care of family. That's exactly what I'm doing. Here's the 90-day accounting and then the 5-man one." Harrove came back. Their auditors spent 6 weeks in our records, found exactly what we'd told them they'd find, and nothing we hadn't. And their senior VP told my dad over coffee in that same conference room that in 30 years he'd never had a contractor open its own wound in front of him, and that it was the only reason they were staying. The bonding company renewed with conditions we were glad to meet. The fraud case ended the way these things actually end. No handcuffs, no gavel montage. Ted Lund's attorneys negotiated a civil settlement. 1.1 million paid back over 4 years. Brightline dissolved and the file stays open in a drawer where everyone involved can feel it. 2 of the 27 sued for wrongful termination. Both cases died on the signed conflict of interest forms I'd made everyone fill out back, when Marcy was laughing at me in leadership meetings. Warranty cards read for pleasure. The company runs at 189 people now. Leaner with a procurement policy I wrote that would survive a siege. And in the lights are still on. That's the part nobody warns you about. There's no lightning bolt. Susan still chairs the hospital gala. The club still loves her. Somewhere in that county tonight. She is remembering the names of powerful men's children and being magnificent at it. Grant was engaged again by Thanksgiving to a woman his mother introduced him to. And I hope it works out better for her than the brochure suggests. Their world kept turning. It just doesn't turn through us anymore. And it turns out that's the whole prize, not their ruin. Our door with a lock on it and me holding the key, instead of the welcome packet. In November, 5 months after the meeting, my dad asked me to walk the warehouse with him, which is his love language and always has been. He stopped at Bay 12, 3rd shelf. It was stacked with copper fittings, real ones, job numbered from a distributor Cal had vetted 3 ways, and Dad stood looking at it the way other men look at church windows. "I fired family," he said at last. "Should have listened to family." That's the entire apology I got. And if you knew Raymond Calloway, you'd know it was a cathedral. Then he offered me the presidency of the company. Him staying on as chairman, boots in the shop, hands off the org chart. I said yes on one condition, and I made him shake on it right there in the aisle. Every hire from now on goes through a 3-person panel. No exceptions, no matter whose last name it carries, including Calloway, especially Calloway. He laughed. Then he saw I meant it, and he shook my hand like a man signing something. At the company picnic that fall, I wore my new badge for the first time. Fiona Calloway, president, a welder's kid, standing next to a shelf you could finally trust, wearing her own name. The one I was born with. The one nobody planted, the one I'd finally stopped apologizing for reading the fine print with. If there's one thing I'd carve over every family's door, it's this. Keeping the peace is not the same as keeping the family. Sometimes the loudest thing you can do for the people you love is to finally stop being quiet. The empty shelf in Bay 12. A welcome packet I signed myself. 9 minutes after a judge's stamp. That's my story. Now tell me yours. What boundary do you wish you'd drawn sooner? Put it in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe to Calm Drama Stories because next week's goes even deeper. Take care of yourself. That's family too.